Okay, dear students, today we are going to take up a new chapter, that is breathing and exchange of gases. So breathing is a very common term. So as an 11th class students, you are very much familiar what is breathing. Breathing is simply the exchange of gases between the body and our environment. And after this breathing activity, what happens is there is a clear exchange of respiratory gases between the circulatory system and the lungs. So here first we will be looking into our respiratory system. So to effect breathing, we have a well-developed respiratory system in our body, and we are very much familiar with the organization of respiratory system that you have studied in 10th class. So just we will have a review of the human respiratory system here. Say, human respiratory system, as we know, so the human respiratory system, here it begins from the nostrils, that is situated at the tip of our nose, and further it leads into nasal cavity, and this nasal cavity passes through the pharynx. Then comes the next part, that is the larynx, then the trachea, then the trachea descends into the thoracic chamber, and there the trachea forks to form two branches. The trachea is divided into two branches, and each of these branch we call as a bronchus. Together we refer it as bronchi, and each bronchus branches into numerous smaller branches, and these smaller branches we call as bronchioles. So that is the arrangement of the different organs in our respiratory system. Then see here, you can see the bronchus, and that bronchus is further divided into smaller and smaller branches, and each of these smaller branches we call as bronchiole. So the bronchioles are in clusters of tiny sacs. The bronchiole ultimately ends in clusters of smaller collections of small balloon-like structures, and each of these sac-like structures we call as alveoli. Then alveoli form the respiratory surface of the lungs. So alveoli, what is the significance of this alveoli? So it is the alveoli that is acting as the actual respiratory surface through which the exchange of gases is taking place during respiration. Then oxygen diffuses through the thin walls of the alveoli into the blood. It is across the wall of this alveoli the exchange of respiratory gases takes place. Especially the oxygen is diffusing through the thin walls of the alveolus into the blood, and then the carbon dioxide from the blood is passing into the alveolus. Then the part of the respiratory system, starting with the external nostrils up to the terminal bronchioles, collectively we call as the conducting part of the respiratory system. So conducting part of the respiratory system consists of the external nostrils, then comes the nasal chamber, then the pharynx, trachea, bronchus and bronchioles. Together we call as the conducting part of the respiratory system. Then the alveoli and the ducts form the exchange parts. The alveoli and the ducts connected to the alveoli together we call as the exchange part of the respiratory system. So the exchange part is the site of the actual diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the atmospheric air. So what is the significance of exchange part of the respiratory system? Exchange part is the site of actual diffusion of oxygen and the carbon dioxide between the blood and the atmospheric air. Then, as we already know, the lungs are located in a particular part of the thoracic chamber, and this thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column, or the thoracic chamber. The lungs are present in the thoracic chamber, and these lungs are further protected by a number of organs surrounding it, and that we call as the chest cage, or the rib cage. It is called as the rib cage, and this rib cage is present within the thoracic chamber, and this rib cage in turn is formed dorsally by the vertebral column, ventrally by the sternum, then laterally the ribs, and on the lower side by the diaphragm. So rib cage is a compartment in which the lungs are well protected, and this rib cage in turn is formed of different parts, like on the dorsal part it is formed by the vertebral column, then ventrally by the sternum, then laterally the ribs, and on the lower side by the diaphragm. So it is in this rib cage the lungs are well protected. Then next we would be looking into the different stages of respiration. So now we have seen how the respiratory system has been placed in our body, and as we have already mentioned, it begins from nostrils and end in the lungs, and the terminal part of the lungs we call as the alveoli. Then next we will be looking how is the process of respiration is effected. And if at all we look into the details of respiration, we can see that whatever changes that is happening during the process of respiration, we can study under different headings. And these include breathing or pulmonary ventilation. The first stage of respiration is breathing or pulmonary ventilation. Second is diffusion of gases across the alveolar membrane. Third is the transport of gases by the blood. Then fourth comes diffusion of gases between blood and tissues. Then the fifth stage is utilization of oxygen by cells and release of carbon dioxide. So these are the different stages we can see in the whole process of respiration. Then first we can see what is actually happening during the process of during the stage of breathing. So there the breathing as a whole is having two different stages, and these are inspiration and expiration. And the movement of air into and out of the lungs is affected by the pressure gradient between the lungs and the atmosphere. So breathing, what is actually happening? The movement of into and out of the lungs. So in that process, at a particular phase, air is moving into the lungs, and the next phase, what is happening? Air is moving out of the lungs. So this movement of air into and out of the lungs is affected by the pressure gradients between the lungs and the atmosphere. There exists a pressure difference between the lungs and the atmosphere. And inspiration occurs when the intrapulmonary pressure is less than the atmospheric pressure. Inspiration is going to happen when the intrapulmonary pressure is less than the atmospheric pressure. Intrapulmonary pressure means the pressure that is existing within the lungs. Then expiration takes place when the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. The air is going to move out. That means expiration is happening at what situation? When the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. Then the diaphragm and the external and internal intercostal muscles helps in the generation of such a gradient. So what enables the generation, the maintenance of such a pressure gradient between the lungs and the outside of the body? So in this maintenance of gradient of pressure, the diaphragm and the external and internal intercostal muscles helps in the generation of such a gradient. And how it is made possible? This maintenance of a gradient. See, for example, so as a first stage of breathing, what happens is the muscles of the diaphragm contract. Muscles of the diaphragm is getting contracted. So normally we know that the diaphragm occupies a dome shape. It is raised upwards because during that stage the muscles remain relaxed. Muscles of the diaphragm is in a relaxed condition during normal resting stage. And at the beginning of breathing, what happens is the muscles of the diaphragm contract, and this leads to the increase in volume of the thoracic chamber in the antero-posterior axis. And the contraction of the diaphragm increases the volume of the thoracic chamber in the antero-posterior axis. So this is the anterior part of our body, and the lower part we call as posterior. In this direction, there is an increase in volume of the thoracic chamber. When the diaphragms contract, the muscles of the diaphragm contract, so that the diaphragm is lowered. Diaphragm occupies a lower position. It comes down. As a result, the volume in the antero-posterior direction in the thoracic chamber increases. Then contraction of the intercostal muscles. So intercostal muscle, we know that it is the muscle that interconnects the different ribs, the muscle that is present between the ribs. So the contraction of the intercostal muscles lifts the ribs and sternum. It raises the ribs upwards and sternum moves forwards. And this movement of ribs and sternum increase the volume of thoracic chamber in the dorsoventral axis. Dorsal in this direction. The dorsal, this is dorsal part of the body and this is ventral part of the body. In this particular direction, what happens? An increase in volume of the thoracic chamber is happening as a result of the contraction of intercostal muscle. Then, so there is an overall increase because of the working of the diaphragm as well as intercostal muscles. What happens? There is an overall increase in the volume of the thoracic chamber. So overall increase in the thoracic volume leads to an increase in pulmonary volume. Pulmonary volume means the lung volume increases as a result of increase in the space in the thoracic chamber. This leads to decrease in intrapulmonary pressure. So as a result of the increase in the pulmonary volume, the pressure inside the lungs decreases, or intrapulmonary pressure decreases, and it becomes lower than the atmospheric pressure. So in this condition, what is going to happen? So we know that air is capable of moving from high pressure area to low pressure area, and we know very well that the intrapulmonary space is in direct contact with the atmospheric air. So when the intrapulmonary pressure decreases, the atmospheric pressure remains higher. As a result, what happens? Air can easily get into the lungs. Air will be automatically flowing into the lungs, and this flowing in of the air into the lungs we call as inspiration. Then we have already learned that expiration is nothing but the reversal of inspiration, the reverse process of inspiration. That means expulsion of the air from the lungs to the atmosphere. So, to effect that, whatever actions had already taken place during inspiration, that would be reversed. So, we have seen that during inspiration, the muscles of the diaphragm contracted. Now, what is going to happen? The diaphragm relaxes. So, the relaxation of the diaphragm and intercostal muscle is happening. Intercostal muscle also had contracted during inspiration. So, both these activities are reversed. What are these activities? The relaxation of the diaphragm and the relaxation of the intercostal muscles. As a result, what happens? The diaphragm and the sternum move to their normal position. Diaphragm and the sternum is moving to their normal position. So, when this happens, there is a reduction in the thoracic volume. As a result of the taking up of the sternum and ribs to their normal position, the thoracic volume decreases. And there is a decrease in pulmonary volume. So, this further reduces the volume of the lungs. And when the volume of the lungs decreases, what happens? There is an increase in the intrapulmonary pressure. Intrapulmonary pressure is going to increase. When the space decreases, the pressure is increasing. And the intrapulmonary pressure is increasing above the atmospheric pressure. As a result, the lungs are pressed, and in order to avoid that extra pressure, what happens? The air from the lungs is expelled out. The air starts moving out into the atmosphere, and this movement of air into the outside we call as expiration. And in a normal healthy person, on an average, a healthy human breathes 12 to 16 times per minute. So, breathing would be happening at a rate of 12 to 16 times in a minute. That means 12 times inspiration and 12 times expiration. So, that is the rate at which breathing is happening in human. That is the normal breathing rate in a healthy person is a healthy adult person is 12 to 16 times in a minute. So here we can see the diagram showing the changes that is happening during inspiration and or inhalation. Inspiration is always called as inhalation, and expiration is always called as exhalation. So see here, the rib cage expands as the rib muscles contract. The intercostal muscles contract, or the rib muscles, or it is always called as intercostal muscles. So the rib cage expands as the rib muscle contracts. Then diaphragm. See the change in the diaphragm. The diaphragm is moving down. See, and as a result, the lungs would be getting expanded. The thoracic volume increases. As a result, the lung volume also increases. And what happens? The pressure within the lung comes down. When volume increases, pressure decreases, so that the air from the outside is moving into the lungs. So that is how the inspiration is affected. And see here, expiration, how it happens. The rib cage gets smaller as rib muscles relax. The intercostal muscle relax, and the muscles of the diaphragm also relaxes, so that it again went back to the original dome-shaped position. As a result, the total thoracic volume decreases, and the pressure that pushes the lungs. As a result, the intrapulmonary pressure increases, so that air start moving out from the lungs to outside, and that we call as a exhalation or a expiration. Then next is the concept of respiratory volumes. So respiratory volume is nothing but how much of air is getting into and out of the lungs during various stages of breathing. So respiratory volume talks about the amount of volume that is handled by various parts of the respiratory system at the various stages. See here, these respiratory volume can be named differently. First expression is the tidal volume. Second comes inspiratory reserve volume. Third is expiratory reserve volume. Then next comes residual volumes. Next is the tidal volume. So these are the four different expressions of respiratory volumes. That is tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, then residual volumes. Then what is tidal volume? So tidal volume is the volume of air inspired or expired with each normal breath. हर एक normal breath में how much of, whether it is during inspiration or expiration, how much volume is taken in or how much volume of air is released out of the lungs, and it measures about 500 ml in a normal healthy person. So that volume we call as a tidal volume. Then second, the inspiratory reserve volume. So it is nothing but it is the volume, it is the extra volume of air that can be inspired over and above the normal tidal volume. So we have additional capacity of taking more air if at all we inspire more forcefully. If at all the inspiration is taking place more powerfully, we have the capacity to take an additional amount of air than the normal tidal volume, and that amount of air we call as inspiratory reserve volume. So it is the extra volume of air that can be inspired over and above the normal breathing, and that amounts to 2500 to 3000 ml in a normal healthy person. Then comes the expiratory reserve volume. Expiratory reserve volume, and it is the maximum extra volume of air that can be expired by forceful expiration after the end of normal tidal expiration. Tidal expiration को छोड़ के added to that, our body has the ability to, our lung has the ability to expel some additional amount of air if at all we expire more powerfully, and that volume of air we call as a expiratory reserve volume. So it is a maximum extra volume of air that can be expired by forceful expiration after the end of normal tidal expiration, and that amounts to 1000 to 1100 ml. Then the residual volume is the volume of air remaining in the lungs after the most forceful expiration. So we have said that in addition to the tidal volume, extra amount of air can be expired out, but even after that expiratory reserve volume, some amount of air will be still remaining within the respiratory system, and that amount of air we call as a residual volume. So residual volume means it is a volume of air remaining in the lungs after the most forceful expiration. Forceful expiration, after doing a forceful expiration, some amount of air is still remaining within the respiratory system, and that amount of air we call as a residual volume, and it amounts to 1100 to 1200 ml in a normal healthy person. Then next comes the inspiratory capacity. Next is inspiratory capacity. So inspiratory capacity equals the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume. tidal volume के साथ if at all we are adding inspiratory reserve volume, that together makes what we call as a inspiratory capacity. Then the functional residual capacity. Functional residual capacity equals the expiratory reserve volume. The expiratory reserve volume plus the residual volume. We together call as a functional residual capacity. Functional residual capacity. It is equal to the expiratory reserve volume plus the residual volume. The next is the concept of lung capacity. Lung capacity. So lung capacity means how much of air the lung can hold. How much of air during breathing? What is the amount of air the lung can have in it? That we refer as lung capacity, and that is expressed in two different forms. One we call as vital capacity. Vital capacity. One expression of lung capacity. So vital capacity equals the inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. So vital capacity is an expression of the inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume plus the expiratory reserve volume. Then next is the total lung capacity. Another expression of lung capacity is called as total lung capacity. So it is the maximum volume to which lungs can be expanded with the greatest possible effort. So total lung capacity is the maximum volume to which lungs can be expanded with the greatest possible. That means when the lungs are maximally expanded, what much of air is held by the lungs. It is equal to the vital capacity plus the residual volume. So total lung capacity is equal to the vital capacity and the residual volume. A table showing various lung capacities and lung volumes. See here, tidal volume 500 ml, inspiratory reserve volume 3000, expiratory reserve volume 1100, residual volume 1200. Then lung capacity is inspiratory capacity 3500, functional residual volume is 2300 ml, vital capacity 4600 ml, and total lung capacity amounts to 5800 ml. So that is breathing. The first part of respiration, that is breathing, is over. It is a purely physical act. The next comes the exchange of gases. So during respiration, there is an exchange of respiratory gases between the body and the atmosphere, or mainly it takes place between the blood and the lung. It begins in the lung level, that is between the lung and the blood. See, the primary site of gas exchange is alveoli. In our respiratory system, the main site where exchange of gases takes place is alveoli. Then the exchange also occurs between blood and the tissues. So the blood, so between the lung and the blood, first exchange of gases takes place, and as a result, the blood gets loaded with oxygen, and this oxygenated blood is flowing to the tissues through the different blood vessels. This oxygenated blood is moving to the different tissues. After reaching the oxygenated blood in the tissues, what happens? There occurs another stage of exchange, that is taking place between the blood and the tissues. Then the exchange of gases in these sites takes place by simple diffusion based on concentration gradient. The basic principle behind the exchange of gases is diffusion. And this diffusion, we already know that in order the diffusion to occur, what should be there? A concentration gradient should be maintained. So here, For exchange of gases, there should be a gradient gradient of concentration between carbon dioxide and oxygen. Then another factor that facilitate, that helps the diffusion is solubility of the gases and thickness of the membrane involved. And other factors that determine the rate of exchange of gases is solubility of the gases. How much is soluble the oxygen and the water in oxygen and carbon dioxide in water, and the thickness of the membrane across which diffusion is taking place. So we know that it is the membrane that is involved in the exchange is the membrane of the alveoli. So how thick the alveolar membrane is, that is also another factor that affects the rate of diffusion. So the main factors that affect the rate of diffusion is the concentration gradient, how much a gradient of concentration is existing, then the solubility of the gases and the thickness of the membrane involved in exchange. Then when we compare the solubility of oxygen and carbon dioxide, we can see that the solubility of carbon dioxide is 20 to 25 times higher than that of oxygen. 20 to 25 times higher than oxygen. Carbon dioxide is more soluble. Thus the amount of carbon dioxide that can be diffused through the diffusion membrane per unit difference in partial pressure is much higher compared to that of oxygen. So thus we can say that as the carbon dioxide is more soluble, we can see that the amount of carbon dioxide that can diffuse through the diffusion membrane per unit difference in partial pressure is much higher when compared to that of oxygen. And the diffusion membrane is made up of 3 layers. The membrane of alveoli is formed made of 3 different layers. One is the squamous epithelium of the alveoli. Then second is the endothelium of the alveolar capillaries, and third is the basement membrane. Then total thickness is much less than a millimeter, even though the alveolar membrane is made up of 3 layers. Its total thickness is much less than a millimeter. So that means this membrane is highly suitable for the exchange of gases. All these factors are favorable for diffusion of oxygen from alveoli to the tissue and that of carbon dioxide from tissue to alveoli. So such factors are helpful for the effective exchange of oxygen from alveoli to the tissue and that of carbon dioxide from tissue to alveoli. See here, you can see a diagrammatic representation how the exchange, what are the factors that favor the exchange of gases between various parts of our respiratory system or between various parts of our body. See here, this shows the alveolus, and see alveolus is filled with the air, and there the partial pressure of oxygen is 104 millimeters of mercury, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide remains 40 millimeters of mercury. And see here, the alveolar surface is lined with the capillaries, and through the capillaries blood is flowing, and that blood contains both oxygen and carbon dioxide. But when compared to alveolar air, the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide is different. So in the blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is found to be higher, and the partial pressure of oxygen remain low. So as a result, what happens? There occur an exchange of these 2 gases. Carbon dioxide, as it is higher in the alveolus, is the carbon dioxide remain higher in the blood, so that from the blood carbon dioxide diffuses out into the lungs. And on the other hand, as oxygen remains higher, it diffuses from the alveolus into the blood, so that the blood becomes oxygenated. And this oxygenated blood is getting into the heart, and from the heart again it is pumped out through the systemic arteries. And in the systemic artery we can see the partial pressure of oxygen is 95 millimeters of mercury, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 millimeters of mercury. That means the condition of oxygenated blood. With regard to the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide, the oxygenated blood is having more of oxygen and less carbon dioxide. And it is this blood that is arriving to the body tissues. So while arriving to body tissues, the conditions are different. So in the tissues, due to the continuous occurrence of metabolic activities, carbon dioxide had already built up and oxygen has been consumed. But here, when these tissues comes in contact with the oxygenated blood, the reverse of what had happened in the alveolar level takes place. That is, oxygen from the blood diffuses into the tissues, and from the tissues, oxygen is carbon dioxide is diffusing out into the blood. As a result, what happens to the blood? The blood gets deoxygenated, or blood becomes impure. So, that blood starts flowing through the systemic veins, or the major veins of the venous system. And there we can see the partial pressure of oxygen has came down much. That is, it became 40 millimeters of mercury, and partial pressure of carbon dioxide has enhanced. And it is this blood that is further getting into the heart, in the right part of the heart, and when the heart beats, what happens? This impure blood is again going to the lungs, and the whole cycle is going to be repeated. So this is this shows how the exchange of gases, respiratory gases, is taking place at the level of alveolus and at the level of